Hey, welcome in everybody to our first of what's going to be a week-long series of pre-comp review videos. Tonight's topic is on the presidencies, and I want to look at each of the 7 presidencies and give you a short bullet point list of key events, developments that happened within these presidencies. And we'll start with GW, George Washington, the first president, of course. With Washington's presidency, there's a couple of highlights that we hit in class to remember. The first is the growing tension that would develop eventually into the split between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Jefferson would lead the Dem-Rep split. He would break away and actually leave Washington's cabinet while serving as Washington's Secretary of State. And a lot of that had to do with the economic plan that Washington supported for Alexander Hamilton. And that was really one of the biggest contributions of Washington's presidency. Hamilton's economic plan is one of the defining moments of George Washington's presidency. The other moment we talked about to be mindful of ties right into Hamilton's economic plan, because one of the parts of Hamilton's plan, along with the bank, the high tariff, and the new taxes, was the Whiskey Rebellion, where irate, disgruntled farmers in Pennsylvania rebelled against the taxes, and that actually led to Washington going into Pennsylvania on horseback in uniform, the only president ever to do that. That was another highlight of George Washington's presidency, and that, again, plays right back into the whole tension emerging within the critical period of Washington's presidency. And then, of course, the other big aspect of Washington's presidency to be on the alert for would be his farewell address, that farewell address that he gave where he warned the United States about political parties. He warned the United States about staying out of foreign affairs. And he really urged the United States to stay neutral. Washington's presidency, 2 terms, I would say those are the main highlights. The economy with Hamilton's plan, the Whiskey Rebellion as one good example, and then, of course, the farewell address. Moving forward to John Adams, we didn't really spend a lot of time on Adams's presidency. If you recall, I kind of focused very heavily on the growing tensions with France. 2 things, France, right? France and the United States, the tensions there. The Dem-Reps, led by Jefferson and Madison, urged to support France in the revolution, but Adams wanted to keep France out of the picture. We had the XYZ affair, where French diplomats tried to bribe American diplomats, and Adams made a big deal out of that. As a result of the XYZ affair, Adams helped build up the Navy and the Army. But Adams's presidency will always be defined by the tensions between Dem-Reps and Federalists. The case study we did was on the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where Madison and Jefferson wrote about nullifying the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were laws passed to silence the Dem-Reps. I'd say without a doubt that's one of John Adams' biggest presidential mistakes, perhaps, but also one of the events we covered, passing the Alien and Sedition laws to quiet the Dem-Reps. So Adams' presidency was definitely defined by France and the tension between Federalists and Dem-Reps. Now, speaking of the Dem-Reps, when Jefferson was elected in 1800, we have a change in power, moving from the Dem-Reps, Federalists now to the Dem-Reps. And without a doubt, that's one of the biggest issues in Thomas Jefferson's presidency, the bloodless revolution that took place that changed the power over now to the Dem-Reps. But within Jefferson's presidency, we talked about the conflict between his interpretation of the Constitution and how that came up in the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson was a strict interpreter of the Constitution. He had a big problem with Hamilton's economic plans because it went out of the boundaries of the Constitution. Well, enter in the Louisiana Purchase, where Jefferson overstepped his power as president to bring all that territory in from France. And that makes one of Jefferson's presidential developments very intriguing. Another presidential development, aside from the Louisiana Purchase, that dealt with foreign powers was how Jefferson sent the Navy to protect American sailors in North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. We called this the Barbary Wars, where Jefferson was the first president to send in the Navy into battle because Islamic pirates were attacking from the North African states. They were attacking American sailors. So Jefferson had his hands full with that incident, and that again was a way that Jefferson used the Constitution, actually in this case, to his advantage. But arguably, probably one of the most important topics we talked about with Jefferson's presidency was trying to shift America more towards his agrarian vision. I use that term a lot with TJ, his agrarian vision. So Jefferson wanted America to become more of a farming nation. That meant acquiring more land. That meant giving farmers more protection, more rights, increasing votership was very important in that aim of Jefferson. So as Jefferson's presidency wore down and passed over to his successor, James Madison, I would say for the big things for Jefferson would be the Agrarian Society, the war with the Barbary pirates, and then, of course, the Louisiana Purchase, and we can't ignore that. James Madison's best remembered definitely for the War of 1812. Sometimes the War of 1812 it was called Mr. Madison's War, because Madison was kind of at the tail end of all those problems that were brewing in Europe, tensions with France and Napoleon, the British impressment policies, those were not solved. So Jefferson and kind of passed that on to Madison, but it was Madison who ultimately would ask Congress to declare war on Britain, and that would lead to the War of 1812, America's second war against the British, which we won, of course, although not without Washington, D.C. being burned down to the ground. Madison, though, was able to salvage the war, and the United States prevailed. So that was probably one of the key points of Madison's presidency, and one of the few things we really got in depth with. For James Monroe, remember Monroe would be the fifth president, and the third consecutive president, Dem Rep president elected. And Monroe is sort of right in the middle of that era of good feelings. If you recall, we talked a lot about the era of good feelings, the intense sense of patriotism and nationalism. And within the era of good feelings, there were all sorts of changes going on. The market revolution, transportation, Henry Clay's American system. There's a lot we sandwiched in there. We spent a lot of time in the era of good feelings. The Second Great Awakening came about during the era of good feelings. So under Monroe, you have the continued domination of the Dem Reps, but you have all these new movements going on in America. The reform movements were starting. Second Great Awakening, so that sense of revivalism was back in the United States. And looking at Monroe's presidency, the Dem Reps are now at the peak of their power. The Federalist Party all but died out, and now you have a president who really just continued America in the direction of the Democratic Republican Party. But I think Monroe, should always be remembered mostly for the era of good feelings and all those issues that were going on there. Moving on from Monroe would be our sixth president, and now the fourth consecutively elected Dem Rep, and that's John Quincy Adams. JQA's presidency, we didn't really go into a lot about JQA, although before I get into JQA, let me back up. One more thing about Monroe, I almost forgot. And actually, it's interesting because JQA was the architect of this policy, but that's in the Monroe Doctrine. Don't forget about the Monroe Doctrine, the warning to Europeans to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, to not colonize near America. JQA would continue with that. But JQA's presidency, we really didn't talk a lot about it. Mainly, we talked about the election of 1824, the corrupt bargain, which paves the way for our conversation today about Andrew Jackson coming to power and starting the Democratic Party. So with JQA, I think you always want to remember him mainly for being kind of the beginning of what would eventually become Jackson's rise to power. And look, I'm kind of leaving out maybe some things, and I'm not going into a lot of depth. The idea is to remind you of these things. What I would suggest doing here is, as I go over some of these events, if you're like, I don't remember much about the era of good feelings, or oh boy, Washington's farewell address, or the Barbary Pirates, or whatever I mentioned, now is when you go back in your notes alongside. And as we talked about today, doing a little bit every day matters as you prepare for your pre-comp. But that's pretty much it for the presidencies. Jackson's our seventh president, and we're going to talk more about his paradoxical presidency tomorrow. With Jackson, of course, just to recap very quickly today's, we talked about the paradox of suffrage, that he wanted more people to vote, but yet women and blacks were still denied the right to vote. And then, of course, the bank wars. Jackson's vendetta against the bank to protect the people as the man of the people. But in the end, it wound up leading to a very cataclysmic economic depression in 1837. So, those are the two paradoxes. And we'll get into more about Jackson's presidency tomorrow. So I bid you guys a good evening and good luck as you progress this week through pre-comp studying. As always, remember the past shapes the future. Have a great night, 7US.